Everyone knows who Jeff Bezos is. Almost no one knows what he actually sacrificed, walking away from a lucrative Wall Street career, crossing the country with no guarantee, to build Amazon in a garage with nothing but a business plan. Chapter 1. The Boy with a Wrench. The screwdriver came first. Nobody remembers exactly where a toddler in a suburban Albuquerque home found one. Maybe a kitchen drawer left open, maybe a toolbox someone forgot to latch. But what the family remembers is what happened next. Jeffrey Preston Jorgensen, not yet 3 years old, applied himself to the bolts of his own crib with a concentration that would have impressed a much older person, and then, with great satisfaction, he took the whole thing apart. He did not do this in a tantrum, in a fit of frustration with bedtime or naps or the general injustice of being small. He did it, by all accounts, because he wanted to understand how it worked, and because, having understood it, he saw no good reason not to. His mother, Jacqueline, was 17 when Jeff was born on January 12, 1964. 17. Let that land for a moment. While most of her peers were worried about prom dates and geometry homework, Jacqueline was navigating motherhood in New Mexico with a husband, Ted Jorgensen, who was barely older than she was and far less ready for the weight of it all. They were two teenagers trying to build a life with none of the tools adults were supposed to have, and for a while they tried. But the trying did not hold. The marriage came apart early, the way young marriages under pressure often do, and Jacqueline found herself raising Jeff largely on her own, which in 1960s Albuquerque was no small thing. What she had, though, was resilience. Jacqueline was not a woman who stayed still under difficulty. She was practical, warm, and quietly formidable, a person who solved the problems in front of her rather than mourning the problems she hadn't expected. Jeff, watching all of this without the vocabulary to name what he was seeing, absorbed it anyway. The lesson that life was something you engaged with rather than waited out, that one soaked in through proximity long before he could articulate it. When Jacqueline met Miguel Bezos, the shape of the family changed for good. Miguel had come to the United States from Cuba at 15, alone, speaking almost no English, carrying nothing but a willingness to work at a pace that embarrassed people who had been born with every advantage. He learned the language. He put himself through college. He built a career as an engineer at Exxon. By the time he married Jacqueline, he was the kind of man who had earned the right to be steady, and steady is exactly what he was. He adopted Jeff and gave him his surname, and in doing so gave him something harder to name than a last name, a model of what disciplined ambition looked like on an ordinary Tuesday. Jeff Bezos. The name fit. It would come to fit the entire century. The boy who grew up carrying that name was not, by most childhood metrics, a normal kid, though he passed for one in the way that very unusual children sometimes do. He was curious in a way that didn't know how to turn itself off. He read voraciously. He asked questions that looped back on themselves in ways that made adults want to look something up. And he had this thing about taking things apart. Not breaking them, there's an important distinction, but disassembling them, understanding them at the level of their component pieces, and then usually trying to put them back together with wildly varying success. His bedroom became, at various points in his childhood, something less like a room where a boy slept and more like a place where a very small and poorly funded research institution was in operation. There were experiments of the scientific variety. There were electronics in stages of being understood. His parents installed an alarm on his door, partly because they loved him and partly because they had learned that giving him unmonitored access to the household's electrical infrastructure was a choice with consequences. It would be easy to tell this part of the story as pure triumph, the genius child fully formed, marching toward destiny with a screwdriver in his little fist. But that's not quite right, and it's not quite fair to the truth of what childhood is, even for people who end up historic. Jeff was also a kid from a family that had been broken and remade. He carried, like all children do, the invisible fingerprints of early loss, of a father who had not stayed, of a mother who had worked very hard to make sure the absence didn't hollow him out. Miguel Bezos was a wonderful stepfather, by all accounts a generous and devoted one, but step is still a word that sits in a child's chest in a particular way, even when everything is good. Whatever quieter weights he carried, Jeff did not seem burdened by them in any way that showed. What showed was the energy, the focus, the streak of stubbornness that his mother would have recognized immediately as her own DNA in different clothes. He was competitive, not cruelly, but absolutely. He wanted to be good at things, and when he wasn't yet, he wanted to understand exactly why so he could fix it. There is something almost comic about the crib story in hindsight. This tiny person applying himself to disassembly before he could reliably speak in full sentences. But it is also, if you squint at it the right way, a genuinely complete portrait of who Jeff Bezos would become. He looked at the world and saw not finished objects but systems. Not things as they were, but things as they could be once you understood their structure and decided to rearrange it. Jacqueline and Miguel were patient with this. They were encouraging in the specific way that good parents are encouraging, not by telling a child he is special, but by not confiscating the screwdriver, by laughing instead of scolding, by understanding that the crib could be replaced but the curiosity, if you killed it early with enough frustration and disapproval, might not come back. They didn't kill it, they let it run. Albuquerque, New Mexico in the mid-1960s was not anyone's idea of the center of the world. But then, very few of the people who end up remaking the world began in the center of it. They began somewhere ordinary, with parents who were doing their best, in houses that had their own small chaos and love mixed together in proportions nobody had planned. Jeff Bezos began in exactly that kind of place, with exactly that kind of family, holding a screwdriver he hadn't been given, pointed at a structure he'd decided should not stand as it was. He was not yet 3 years old, and he was already completely himself. Chapter 2. The Garage on the Ranch. The summer heat in the Texas Panhandle is not a metaphor. It is a physical fact, the kind that sits on your chest when you step outside and makes you question every decision that led you to this moment. For young Jeff, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing in a pasture with sweat already soaking through his shirt before breakfast, the question wasn't philosophical. It was practical. What needs fixing today, and how do we fix it? His grandfather, Lawrence Preston Giese, Pop to the family, was not a man who explained things twice. He had spent years as a regional director for the Atomic Energy Commission, a job that required him to hold complicated systems in his head and coax them toward function. When he retired to his sprawling ranch outside Cotulla, Texas, he brought that same disposition with him. The ranch didn't care about your feelings. The windmill either worked or it didn't. The cattle either got what they needed or they didn't. And if something was broken, you didn't call somebody. You went and got your hands dirty. Jeff arrived every summer like clockwork, exchanging whatever suburban routine he'd left behind for something rawer and considerably less air-conditioned. Pop put him to work immediately, not as a lesson and not as character-building theater, but because the ranch actually needed the help. There's a difference between manufactured hardship and the real thing, and Jeff was getting the real thing. Repairing windmills was one of those jobs that sounds almost romantic until you're doing it. In practice, it meant climbing a rickety metal structure in the blinding sun, figuring out what had seized or cracked or corroded, and then fixing it with whatever tools and ingenuity you had on hand because the nearest hardware store was not around the corner. Jeff learned early that improvisation wasn't a fallback plan. It was the plan. Pop would stand below, offering minimal guidance, occasionally shading his eyes to look up, and Jeff would work through the problem piece by piece until something clicked, literally and figuratively. Then there was the cattle work, which required a different kind of resolve entirely. Castrating cattle is not something you ease into. There is no graceful introduction to the task. Pop handled it with the calm efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times, and Jeff, to his credit, didn't flinch away. He understood that sentiment had its place, but that place was not in the middle of a working ranch with livestock to manage and a grandfather who expected you to see things through. You learned to be useful. You learned to be steady. You learned, in the particular vocabulary of ranch life, that squeamishness was a luxury. What made those summers transformative wasn't any single dramatic moment. It was the accumulation of small, unglamorous victories. The windmill that ran again, the fence line that held, the machine you'd puzzled over for 2 hours that finally yielded to a specific turn of a specific wrench. Pop rarely offered praise in the conventional sense, but there was something in the way he moved on to the next task. Briskly, without looking back, that communicated something like approval. "You did it. Good. Here's the next thing." That rhythm worked its way into Jeff in a way that formal instruction never quite could. Problems were not obstacles. They were just the current state of affairs, waiting to be changed by someone patient enough to work through them. This sounds simple, even obvious, but it is actually a fairly radical orientation. Most people learn early and repeatedly that certain problems are above their pay grade. Someone else handles it. An expert arrives. You wait. Pop's ranch offered no such escape hatch. If Jeff couldn't fix the thing stayed broken and the ranch suffered for it. There is something else worth noting about those summers, something that tends to get lost when people trace the origins of ambition back to their most cinematic moments. Pop wasn't just teaching Jeff how to repair windmills, he was demonstrating a particular relationship between a person and the world around them. Not a relationship of entitlement, not "I deserve for this to work," but something more like "I am responsible for making this work." The distinction is enormous. One produces frustration when the world doesn't cooperate. The other produces ingenuity. Pop also showed Jeff, by quiet example, that a life of the mind and a life of the hands didn't have to be separate. Here was a man who had dealt in nuclear policy and Cold War logistics and who could also jury-rig a pump on a Tuesday afternoon without breaking a sweat. Intellect and practicality weren't competing values. They reinforced each other. The best thinking happened when you were actually trying to solve something real. The ranch had a spaciousness to it, obviously geographical, but also something harder to name. Time moved differently out there. The problems were immediate and tactile. You couldn't defer them into a spreadsheet or a meeting, and Jeff, who was already the kind of kid who needed to understand how things worked, who couldn't be in a room with a mechanism without wondering about its interior logic, found that the ranch met him at exactly the level of engagement he craved. There was always something to understand. There was always something to fix. By the end of each summer, Jeff went home a little different, not transformed in the dramatic, thunderclap sense of stories that get cleaned up in the retelling, but quietly recalibrated, a bit more willing to sit with a problem, a bit less interested in waiting for permission or expertise to arrive from somewhere else, a bit more certain that the gap between a broken thing and a working thing was crossable, given enough patience and the right angle of approach. Those summers didn't make him invincible, and they didn't make him infallible. What they made him was someone who trusted his own hands, his own reasoning, his own willingness to stay in the discomfort of a problem until it gave way. For a boy who would spend his adult life making enormous bets on things that didn't yet exist, that quality, more than any aptitude test score or classroom achievement, would prove to be the most durable thing Pop ever gave him. The ranch still stood when Jeff was grown. The Texas heat still sat on your chest in August, and somewhere in the muscle memory of a man who would one day build one of the largest logistical systems in human history, there was a windmill turning again because a kid decided to climb up and figure it out. Chapter 3. Princeton and the Pull of Wall Street. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over an Ivy League campus in the hours before dawn, a stillness that feels borrowed from somewhere more serious than ordinary life. Jeff Bezos knew that quiet well. He had claimed it for himself, staying in the computer labs at Princeton long after reasonable people had gone to sleep, running calculations and debugging code with the focused intensity of someone who had decided very early on that sleep was a negotiable expense. He arrived at Princeton in 1982 with the sort of academic record that makes admissions officers feel like they've done something genuinely good with their day. He declared electrical engineering and computer science, a combination that suited him perfectly because it demanded two things he already possessed in unusual quantities: the ability to think in systems and the impatience to make those systems work. Princeton trained engineers to ask how things functioned. Bezos kept asking why they couldn't function better. He was not, by most accounts, the kind of student who coasted. He was competitive in the way that certain people are competitive, not loudly or meanly, but with a kind of internal thermostat permanently set to maximum. There is a famous story from his undergraduate years involving a physics problem that had stumped him and a small group of classmates for hours. After working through pages of increasingly desperate calculations, Bezos stared at the ceiling and then, with what witnesses described as almost eerie calm, derived a solution from a completely different angle. His roommate later said it was like watching someone take a locked door off its hinges rather than trying the knob. The problem hadn't changed. His approach had. By 1986, he graduated summa cum laude, a distinction that at Princeton is not handed out as a participation trophy. He was Phi Beta Kappa. He had built a mind that could hold both the elegance of theoretical mathematics and the gritty practicality of engineering, two temperaments that usually don't share the same skull without friction. In Bezos, they had somehow reached a détente, and the result was a person who could appreciate a beautiful proof and then immediately ask what it was good for. Wall Street noticed. The recruiting process for a Princeton graduate with his credentials in the mid-1980s was less a job search than a slow procession of increasingly lavish supplicants. Firms arrived on campus in good suits bearing promises of money, prestige, and the particular intoxicant of feeling like the smartest person in a very expensive room. Bezos was courted by some of the most powerful financial institutions in the country, which is to say he was offered multiple versions of a life that most people would have accepted without pausing to breathe. He tried a few stops along the way, working at Fitel, a startup building international trading networks, and later at Bankers Trust, where he helped develop computer systems for financial products. He was good at it. He was good at most things he turned his attention to, which can be its own peculiar burden. But it was D.E. Shaw that changed the temperature of his ambitions. D.E. Shaw was not a typical hedge fund. It was founded by David Shaw, a Columbia computer science professor, and it operated more like a research lab that happened to make extraordinary amounts of money than like a traditional financial firm. The people there weren't simply traders, they were mathematicians, physicists, and computer scientists who had decided that the market was, at its heart, an information problem, and that information problems yielded to the right algorithms. For Bezos, walking into DE, Shaw was probably the closest thing to professional love at first sight that a young man who thought in code and systems could experience. He rose quickly. He was sharp enough to earn respect in a building full of people who did not give it cheaply, and personable enough that his intelligence didn't read as a rebuke to everyone around him. By his early 30s, he was a senior vice president, a title that meant real authority, real compensation, and the kind of telephone calls that get returned promptly. He was, by any conventional measurement, winning. He had a good apartment in Manhattan, a future that looked like a straight line toward extraordinary wealth, and the daily satisfaction of working on problems that were genuinely hard. The life was good. It is important to say that plainly because what came next only makes sense if you understand what he was willing to walk away from. In 1994, somewhere in the ordinary passage of a working day, Bezos came across a statistic so improbable that it briefly shorted out his ordinarily very reliable sense of proportion. The internet at that moment in history was growing at 2,300% per year. He would later describe reading that number as a clarifying experience, which is an admirably restrained way of saying it hit him like a wall. 2,300%, not the market for some product, not a niche trend in a specialized sector, the entire internet. The infrastructure of a new world was assembling itself in real time, at a velocity that had no clean historical precedent, and most of the people walking past him on the streets of Manhattan had only the vaguest notion it was happening. Bezos had spent years learning to spot the gap between where things were and where they could be. It was the same instinct that had him rebuilding systems in the Princeton computer labs before the sun came up, the same impulse that made D.E. Shaw's algorithmic approach to markets feel like home. And now he was staring at a number that described not a gap, but a chasm, an opening so vast that the rational response seemed almost irrational. He sat with the statistic, he turned it over, he stress-tested it as a man trained in his particular way would naturally do. And the more he examined it, the more certain he became that the conclusion was inescapable. Something enormous was about to happen, and the only question that mattered was whether you showed up for it or watched from a very comfortable distance. The comfortable distance was available to him. He had earned it. It was sitting right there in the form of a senior vice presidency at one of the most sophisticated financial firms in the world, with a salary that made the decision objectively insane by any normal calculus. His boss at D.E. Shaw, to his credit, did not try to pretend otherwise. When Bezos told him he was thinking of leaving to start an internet company selling books, Shaw suggested they take a long walk together through Central Park before anyone made any decisions they couldn't take back. It was a reasonable request. It was the kind of advice a good mentor gives when a star employee appears to be experiencing a temporary break from sanity. And somewhere on that walk, with Manhattan rising on all sides and the future still technically undecided, Jeff Bezos was already gone. Chapter 4. The Regret Minimization Framework. Here is a perfectly good way to ruin a career. Read a single statistic and let it eat you alive. In 1994, Jeff Bezos was a senior vice president at D.E. Shaw, one of the most mathematically sophisticated hedge funds on the planet. He was 30 years old, earning serious money, respected by serious people, and operating in a world that rewarded those qualities richly and predictably. By any conventional measure, he was winning, and then he stumbled across a data point suggesting that internet usage was growing at roughly 2,300% per year, and the conventional measure quietly stopped mattering. He did not act immediately. That matters. There is a popular mythology that visionaries move on instinct alone, that the great leap comes in a flash, that genius operates on feeling rather than method. Bezos was not that kind of dreamer. He was the kind who, when standing at the edge of the cliff, first built a small mental scaffold to figure out whether jumping was actually the right move. He called it the Regret Minimization Framework, which is exactly the sort of name a Princeton-trained engineer would give to what most people simply call a gut check. The concept was straightforward and quietly devastating in its clarity. Project yourself forward to age 80, look back at your life from that vantage point, and ask which choice you would regret more. Not which choice was safer, not which choice paid better, not which choice your boss or your colleagues or your parents would applaud. Which one, in the long rear view of a life fully lived, would leave the sharper ache? He told himself a story. In this story, he is 80 years old, sitting somewhere comfortable, thinking back on 1994. In one version, he had stayed at D.E. Shaw, collected his bonuses, climbed his ladder, and watched from the shore while a few wild-eyed strangers built the internet into something unimaginable. Would he regret not having tried? He knew himself well enough to know the answer was yes. A loud, humiliating yes that would follow him into whatever counted as the afterlife for overachievers. In the other version, he had tried and failed. He had left the safe job, bet everything on a half-formed idea, and watched it collapse. Would he regret that? Surprisingly, measurably less. Failure, he reasoned, was something he could make peace with, the honest swing and the miss. What he could not make peace with was the pitch he never took. The framework sounds tidy in retrospect. At the time, it was how a deeply rational man gave himself permission to do something that looked, from the outside, frankly insane. His boss at D.E. Shaw, a brilliant man who had built a firm on the premise that smart people should trust math over emotion, took the news of Bezos's resignation with notable equanimity. He asked him to take 2 days before deciding. He suggested that this sounded like a great idea for someone who did not already have a great job. Bezos told him he was right. He also told him he was leaving anyway. What followed was one of the great American road trips, depending entirely on your tolerance for business plans read aloud at highway speeds. Bezos and his wife Mackenzie loaded their life into a car and headed west, and while Mackenzie drove, Jeff talked. Not to her exactly, or not only to her. He talked at a laptop, narrating what Amazon might become, what it would sell, how it would ship, where the leverage was hidden. Mackenzie drove. Jeff built a company in the air between the dashboard and the windshield. She deserves a sentence or two that is not an afterthought. Mackenzie was not a passive passenger. She had a Princeton literature degree and a sharpness that would later produce novels and, eventually, one of the most quietly consequential philanthropic pledges in modern history. That she sat calm behind the wheel while her husband dictated their mutual gamble into the void suggests either extraordinary faith or extraordinary patience. Possibly both. The marriage was young, the savings were finite, and the destination was a garage. Bellevue, Washington was not a romantic place to start a revolution. They rented a modest house and commandeered the garage, which became a laboratory of the extremely provisional kind. There were extension cords running in directions that would concern a fire marshal, There was a door repurposed as a desk, a detail Bezos would tell and retell for decades because it captured something he genuinely believed, that you could build something enormous from almost nothing if you were willing to start before conditions were optimal. June 5, 1994. Amazon was incorporated. Not launched, not profitable, not noticed by anyone, just legally born, blinking in a garage while the rest of the world went about its business. They tested the site by ordering books through it themselves, watching the process for errors the way a new parent watches a sleeping baby for signs of breathing. The first real customer order arrived and was so exciting that Bezos and the handful of early employees celebrated loudly enough for the neighbors to wonder what was happening next door. What was happening next door, it turned out, was the early assembly of something that would eventually touch more human commerce than almost any institution in history. But they did not know that yet. They just knew a book had shipped. The Regret Minimization Framework was not a magic spell. It did not guarantee success or protect against the 1,000 ways a startup could quietly die. What it did was something subtler. It moved the question off the balance sheet and onto a more honest ledger. It forced Bezos to stop asking whether this was likely to work and start asking whether trying was worth it regardless. That shift, from probability to meaning, was the real decision. There is something almost comic about the gap between what the framework sounds like and what it cost. A mental model, a thought experiment, a man asking himself how he might feel at 80. And from that soft interior calculus emerged a company that would eventually reshape how civilization moves goods, stores data, reads books, and hears music. The stakes of the decision, visible now in full, bear almost no resemblance to the quiet moment in which it was made. But that is, perhaps, exactly the point. The largest things often start not with a bang but with a person sitting still, asking themselves a very honest question and finding that they already know the answer. Chapter 5. Everything store books were never the point. That is the thing people forget, or perhaps never fully knew. When Amazon opened its virtual doors in 1995 and customers began ordering paperbacks and hardcovers with the novelty of people who had just discovered fire, Jeff Bezos accepted their money with a gracious smile and privately thought about everything else in the world that could be sold. Books were the Trojan horse. The real army was still being assembled. He had chosen books strategically. There were 3 million titles in print at any given time, far too many for any physical store to stock, which meant an online catalog offered an immediate and obvious advantage over your local Barnes & Noble. It was a brilliant opening move. But Bezos was already thinking about the endgame before most people had figured out the opening. He wanted to sell music, then electronics, then toys, then groceries, then everything. He wanted Amazon to become, in his own internal shorthand, the everything store, a phrase he used with his early team so often that it became simultaneously inspiring and mildly exhausting, the way any visionary phrase does when it gets repeated in enough Monday morning meetings. The path from bookstore to everything store was not a straight line. It was more like a fever dream drawn by someone who had consumed too much coffee and not enough sleep, which, as it happened, was an accurate description of Amazon's Seattle offices in the late 1990s. In 1998, Amazon added music, then videos, then electronics. Each expansion was greeted inside the company with the particular mixture of excitement and dread that comes from being asked to run faster while the ground is still uncertain beneath your feet. Bezos drove his teams with a relentlessness that employees would describe later, often in therapy, as both galvanizing and terrifying. He had a laugh that witnesses described as a full-body event, a honking, braying sound that reportedly echoed off walls and startled interns. But behind the laugh was a man who read every customer complaint letter personally and expected answers. He once sent a question mark, just a single punctuation mark, nothing else, to an executive whose department had received a complaint. No context, no explanation, just the question mark. The executive reportedly convened an emergency meeting. The late 1990s were a strange and giddy time. Money was pouring into anything with a .com suffix, and Amazon was catching its share of it. The stock price climbed into absurdity, which made Bezos wealthy on paper and gave him the capital to keep spending in ways that alarmed investors almost as much as they alarmed competitors. The strategy was simple to describe and brutal to execute. Reinvest everything, absorb losses, grow fast, worry about profits later. Wall Street analysts wrung their hands publicly. Bezos essentially thanked them for their concern and announced free shipping. He was not oblivious to the anxiety around him. He understood, probably better than his critics gave him credit for, that the whole construction could collapse. But he had a particular gift for separating short-term noise from long-term signal, for asking not what would matter next quarter, but what would matter in 10 years. He would later frame this as a core leadership principle, but in those early, scrappy years it manifested more simply. He believed, with a conviction that occasionally bordered on the unreasonable, that the internet was not a fad, that customers would eventually want everything delivered to their homes, and that whoever built the best infrastructure to do that would own the future. Then the future tried to kill him. The dot-com crash of 2000 and 2001 did not merely correct the market, it incinerated it. Companies that had been valued in the billions became valueless in months. Pets.com, Webvan, Cosmo.com. The casualties were numerous and, in retrospect, instructive. Amazon's own stock fell from a high of over $100 per share to below 10. Analysts who had wrung their hands now wrote obituaries. One particularly confident voice declared that Amazon was Amazon.toast. The mockery had a specific cruelty to it, the kind that comes when people who privately feared you might succeed suddenly sense that you are bleeding. Amazon was indeed bleeding, but it was not dead. Bezos cut costs with the same ferocity with which he had once expanded. He laid off workers, a decision that cost him personally. He did not enjoy it, regardless of how the mythology around him sometimes suggested otherwise. He pushed remaining teams harder. He insisted on frugality as a principle, famously making doors into desks by laying wooden boards over sawhorses, a cost-cutting measure that became in retrospect both legend and punchline. You could either be inspired by the door desk or find it a little much. Many employees felt both things simultaneously. What the crash clarified was something Bezos had suspected all along. Survival belonged to whoever had built something real underneath the hype. Amazon had warehouses, Amazon had logistics, Amazon had customers who had actually used the site and found it useful. When the speculative froth burned away, those things remained. Competitors that had existed primarily as PowerPoint slides and venture capital optimism did not make it. Amazon did. By 2002 and 2003, the company was not merely surviving, it was quietly reorganizing itself for the next expansion. There was talk internally about using Amazon's computing infrastructure, built to handle holiday traffic spikes, as a service it could offer to outside developers. There were experiments in new product categories, new fulfillment models, new ways to get things to people faster and cheaper than anyone thought possible. The everything store was still being constructed, floor by floor, in relative silence, while the rest of the business world was still assessing the damage from the crash and writing think pieces about the death of e-commerce. The lesson of the dot-com era, as Bezos saw it, was not that ambition was dangerous. The lesson was that ambition without infrastructure was theater. You could dream as large as you wanted, provided you were also willing to dig the foundations deep and wide, to do the unglamorous, grinding, often invisible work that made the dream load-bearing. He had done that work, his people had done that work, and now, on the other side of the chaos, Amazon stood, battered, leaner, and, as its rivals were beginning to realize with no small measure of alarm, more dangerous than it had ever been. The bookstore was a memory. The everything store was just getting started. Chapter 6. The Empire Expands. Picture a business meeting in 2006 where someone stands up and says, with a straight face, that the most profitable thing a bookstore could possibly do next is rent out its spare computers to strangers over the internet. In most companies, that person gets a polite smile and a one-way ticket back to whatever department they crawled out of. At Amazon, that person got a budget, a deadline, and a directive from Jeff Bezos himself to move faster. Amazon Web Services arrived in the world with almost no fanfare, which turned out to be one of the most consequential quiet entrances in the history of American business. There were no stadium keynotes, no celebrity endorsements, no breathless press releases promising to change the world. There was just a set of tools, cloud storage, computing power, databases, offered at prices that made no sense to competitors until, suddenly, they made all the sense in the world. Startups that once needed millions of dollars in servers to get off the ground now needed a credit card in an afternoon. Netflix ran on AWS. NASA stored mission data there. The CIA signed a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The backbone of the modern internet was not built in Silicon Valley. It was built by the same company that was still shipping you paperback novels and bubble mailers. Bezos had seen something that most of the tech industry had missed, which was that Amazon had accidentally become very good at building scalable, reliable infrastructure for itself, and if you were good at something, you did not keep it a secret, you sold it. And the profit margins on cloud computing, it turned out, were considerably more flattering than the margins on selling someone a used copy of a Tom Clancy novel for $6.49 with free shipping. AWS was the chess move that nobody saw coming, but Bezos was not finished rearranging the board. In November 2007, he walked on stage at a small event in New York and introduced the Kindle, and the publishing industry experienced the particular sensation of a rug being pulled from beneath a very expensive carpet. The device was not beautiful exactly. Early models had a slightly angular, utilitarian look that tech critics described charitably as distinctive, but within 5.5 hours of going on sale, it had sold out completely, and within months it had done something that publishers had believed was emotionally and culturally impossible. It had made people genuinely comfortable reading books on a screen. Bezos had always loved books, deeply and personally, which perhaps explained why he understood that what people loved was not the paper, it was the story. Give them the story faster, cheaper, and in a device they could carry 1,000 books inside and they would follow. They did. There was something quietly emotional about the Kindle, actually, if you thought about it long enough. Bezos had started Amazon because he believed books were the ideal first product for the internet age, that books were sacred but also numerous and searchable and categorizable. The Kindle was, in a sense, the completion of that original instinct, the moment when the man who had digitized the bookstore digitized the book itself. He had not abandoned the thing he started with, he had just taken it further than anyone thought it could go. Then came Prime. Amazon Prime launched in 2005 technically, but its consequences bloomed across the following decade like a slow, unstoppable tide. For $79 a year. Later more, always more, customers got free 2-day shipping on millions of items, and that simple promise rewired something deep in the American consumer brain. People stopped asking whether they needed something immediately and started expecting that everything arrived immediately as a matter of course. Retailers who had spent decades building logistics networks watched in dismay as their customers quietly recalibrated their expectations around Amazon's delivery speeds. The threshold for acceptable waiting had moved, and Prime had moved it, and there was no moving it back. What Bezos understood, and what took competitors years to fully accept, was that Prime was not a shipping program. It was a loyalty trap, affectionately designed. Once a customer paid for Prime, they were psychologically invested in using Amazon enough to justify the membership fee, which meant they shopped there first, always, reflexively, the way a person with a gym membership goes to that gym specifically even when there are other gyms. Prime Video came later, and Prime Music and Prime Reading, and suddenly the subscription was not a shipping benefit with extras, it was a lifestyle platform with shipping included. And then, because apparently the retail industry, the cloud industry, and the publishing industry were not enough, Bezos put Amazon inside the house. The Amazon Echo arrived in 2014, and with it came Alexa, a voice that lived in a black cylinder on your kitchen counter and would answer questions, play music, set timers, order toilet paper, and dim your lights if you had the right bulbs, which Amazon would also be delighted to sell you. Alexa was funny, in both senses of the word, capable of a dry, earnest wit that made people laugh, and also strange in a way that took adjustment. People found themselves saying please and thank you to it, which said less about the technology and more about the humans using it. The home had been the last truly private space. the one territory no retailer had ever colonized, and Bezos had planted a flag there by making it feel like a convenience rather than an invasion. Critics would eventually have a great deal to say about that particular development, but in the moment, the reviews were largely rapturous. What united all of it, AWS and the Kindle and Prime and Alexa, was a philosophy that Bezos articulated in various forms over various years, but that amounted to this: do not think about what the customer wants today. Think about what will still be true about what the customer wants in 10 years. People would always want things delivered fast. People would always want data stored reliably. People would always want reading to be easy and music to be available and their homes to feel a little bit magical. Build for those constants, and the future tends to show up early. He was not at this point building a company in any ordinary sense of the word. Companies had competitors and market caps and quarterly earnings calls. What Bezos was building was closer to infrastructure, the kind of thing that you do not notice until it is gone, the kind of thing that a civilization quietly comes to depend upon without quite deciding to. Governments and rivals spent years trying to catch up, writing regulations and launching competing products and delivering speeches about the dangers of concentrated power. And meanwhile, the packages kept arriving, the servers kept humming, and Alexa kept setting timers in 10 million kitchens, waiting patiently for the next question. Chapter 7. The Cost of Empire. Somewhere in a fulfillment center the size of 17 football fields, a human being is running. Not jogging, not briskly walking with purpose, running. Because the algorithm says there are 11 seconds left to retrieve a box of kitchen tongs from aisle 34, section G, shelf 9, and if those 11 seconds expire, the scanner will register a miss, the miss will become a metric, and the metric will become a reason. The floor supervisor doesn't need to say anything. The system speaks for itself, in beeps and red digits and the faint, creeping dread that the machine notices everything. This was the other Amazon, not the one investors celebrated over champagne when the market cap crossed $1 trillion for the first time in 2018, making Amazon only the second company in history to reach that altitude. This was the Amazon you found when you followed the loading dock around the back. The stories began trickling out slowly, then arrived in a flood. Journalists embedded themselves in warehouses and emerged looking shaken. Former employees described bathroom breaks timed to the minute, walking up to 15 miles a shift on concrete floors, pain they learned to ignore because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant termination. The phrase urinating in bottles entered the public lexicon not as hyperbole, but as documented testimony. Workers who felt they could not afford the time to reach a restroom because the quota would not pause while they did. When Amazon initially denied these accounts, a congressman produced evidence suggesting otherwise, and Amazon, to its credit and perhaps embarrassment, issued a public acknowledgement and an apology. The injury rates were harder to apologize away. Reports from the Strategic Organizing Center, a coalition of unions, found that Amazon's serious injury rate was nearly double the industry average for warehouse and storage facilities. The company disputed the methodology. Critics disputed the dispute. Meanwhile, the conveyor belts kept moving. None of this was secret exactly, and none of it made Amazon unusual in the long, grim history of industrial labor. What made it singular was the contrast, and contrast, in storytelling as in life, is where the real electricity lives. While workers in Phoenix and Kenosha and Shakopee were filing workers' compensation claims, Jeff Bezos was purchasing a 417-foot superyacht widely reported to cost around $500 million, a vessel so enormous it reportedly required a separate support yacht to carry its toys. The imagery practically wrote itself, and the internet, never one to waste good imagery, wrote it enthusiastically. There were memes, there were op-eds, there was a Dutch city that briefly considered whether it would allow the yacht to pass under a historic bridge. It was a news cycle that perfectly captured the surreal economics of the era, simultaneously absurd and completely real. By 2021, Bezos had accumulated a personal fortune that analysts estimated at over $200 billion at its peak, a number so large it resists comprehension. Comparisons to the GDP of nations were not rhetorical flourishes, they were arithmetic. Portugal, New Zealand, hungry. His net worth could purchase any of those countries' annual economic output and still have billions remaining. This was not wealth in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a new category of thing that the language hadn't quite caught up to. Congress, meanwhile, had caught up just enough to be angry. Senator Bernie Sanders became something of a one-man Bezos Accountability Bureau, introducing the Stop Bezos Act with the kind of legislative naming flair that suggests someone on his staff was having a very good time. The bill targeted corporations whose employees received public assistance, a pointed observation that Amazon workers in some states qualified for Medicaid and food stamps. The company did raise its minimum wage to $15 an hour in 2018, a move Bezos announced with evident pride and that Sanders grudgingly acknowledged. The raise was real. It also came with the elimination of certain stock bonuses and incentive pay for some workers, a detail that complicated the headline. What is fair to say is that Bezos was not indifferent to these criticisms in the reflexive, reptilian way that some executives perform indifference. He had, over the years, expressed a genuine belief that Amazon was creating enormous value and enormous jobs, that the fulfillment centers, for all their hardship, were rungs on ladders for people who needed rungs. He was not entirely wrong. Hundreds of thousands of people cashed paychecks because of the company he built, and in communities where Amazon opened warehouses, the local employment numbers frequently moved. Whether those jobs were good jobs by any adequate definition was a separate and furious argument. He did not, however, spend much time publicly sitting with the discomfort of the harder questions. The persona he had cultivated, laughing at shareholder meetings, riding rockets, building the future, did not have an obvious register for doubt or reckoning. There were no hair-shirt moments, no visible nights of the soul. Whether such moments existed privately is unknowable. What was visible was the forward-looking certainty, the same quality that had always propelled him, now serving also as a kind of shield. Labor organizing accelerated. The Amazon Labor Union's victory at the Staten Island Fulfillment Center in April 2022 became one of the more genuinely stunning upsets in modern American labor history. A grassroots campaign led by a former Amazon worker named Chris Smalls, whom Amazon executives had once reportedly dismissed in terms that became, when leaked, a spectacular public relations catastrophe. Smalls organized anyway. His workers voted to unionize anyway. The headline writers could barely keep up. The company lobbied hard in many states against unionization efforts and spent heavily on what it called union avoidance training. Critics called it something less polite. More campaigns followed, with mixed results. The genie, as they say, had experienced some difficulty returning to the bottle. It would be too easy to resolve this chapter with a verdict, to declare either that Amazon lifted millions or crushed them, because the honest answer is that it did both, often to different people and sometimes to the same person on different days. The economy Amazon helped reshape created genuine abundance and genuine precarity, often separated by nothing thicker than a zip code or a job classification. That is the specific texture of the era Bezos built, an era in which a man could wake up, check his phone, and learn that he was $20 billion richer than he had been when he went to sleep, while 3 time zones away one of his employees was icing her knees before a shift that started at 4 in the morning. History has a long memory for this kind of arithmetic, and it has rarely been kind to the side of the ledger that didn't need the kindness. Chapter 8. Personal Turbulence. There is no elegant way to tell 400 million people your marriage is over, so Jeff Bezos and Mackenzie did the only thing available to 2 intensely private people living in an age of zero privacy. They sent a tweet, January 9, 2019. The message was calm, carefully worded, almost eerie in its composure. After a long period of loving exploration and trial separation, we have decided to divorce. They described each other as friends, partners, cherished parents. The internet, predictably, did not accept this level of serenity at face value. Within minutes, the announcement had fractured into 1,000 simultaneous conversations, most of them doing the math. Mackenzie owned roughly 4% of Amazon. 4% of Amazon at that particular moment in history amounted to somewhere in the neighborhood of $36 billion. The love story was the headline, but the numbers were the story underneath the story. They had been married for 25 years. That detail is easy to slide past, especially when billion-dollar figures are competing for attention, but 25 years is a genuinely long time. They met at D.E. Shaw, where Mackenzie was his administrative assistant, and he was, by all accounts, already the most relentlessly driven person in any room he occupied. She saw something in the laugh. She has described it that way. The laugh, which was enormous and slightly ridiculous and completely without self-consciousness, convinced her that here was a man who was fully, authentically himself. They married in 1993. She rode in the passenger seat when he drove cross-country to start a company that had no guarantee of working. She wrote novels while he rewired commerce. She raised 4 children while he built infrastructure for civilization. And then, quietly, over what the statement described as a long period, the architecture of the marriage gave way. The split itself was handled with the kind of mutual dignity that made observers vaguely suspicious, because public divorces among the extraordinarily wealthy rarely look like this. No courtroom theater, no warring attorneys issuing poison-tipped press releases. Mackenzie received 25% of their Amazon holdings, the largest divorce settlement in recorded history at the time, and promptly signed the Giving Pledge, committing the majority of her fortune to charity. She has since given away billions with a speed and intentionality that has made her one of the most consequential philanthropists on the planet, funding racial equity organizations, food banks, public schools, and community colleges without the fanfare that typically accompanies donations at that scale. She dropped the Bezos surname, returned to Scott her middle name, and seemed to step out of the shadow of the empire as deliberately as she'd once helped build it. Jeff, meanwhile, was navigating a different kind of exposure. Weeks after the divorce announcement, the National Enquirer published intimate text messages between Bezos and Lauren Sanchez, a television anchor and helicopter pilot with whom he had begun a relationship. The messages were embarrassing in the way that private messages always are when stripped of context and printed next to unflattering photographs. But embarrassing was only the beginning. Bezos, through his security consultant Gavin DeBecker, began investigating how the messages had been obtained. The theory that emerged was troubling. The phone may have been compromised by a hack tied to a WhatsApp message sent from a number associated with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The geopolitical thread was dizzying enough that most people needed a moment to process how a celebrity gossip story had tunneled into the territory of international intelligence operations. And then Bezos did something that surprised nearly everyone. He published a blog post on Medium, not through a publicist, not via a carefully managed press conference, calling out American Media Inc., the parent company of the National Enquirer, directly. He alleged that AMI had contacted his representatives with an explicit offer: kill any investigation into how the messages were obtained, or we publish more compromising photographs. He quoted the alleged communications verbatim. The central line about whether Bezos would prefer the photos to be made public was printed in full. It was a calculated dare, written with the cool nerve of someone who had spent decades playing games of enormous consequence and had learned that flinching was always the more dangerous option. The post was titled, "No Thank You, Mr. Pecker," a reference to AMI's CEO, David Pecker, and the internet, for one brief shining moment, was genuinely unsure whether to applaud or collapse in disbelief that the richest man on earth had just published that sentence with a straight face. He framed the post not as victimhood but as defiance, arguing that powerful entities using embarrassing private material to silence journalists or powerful individuals was a threat that extended far beyond his own situation. Critics noted, fairly, that it was somewhat easier to stare down extortion when you were sitting on a fortune that could absorb almost any legal battle imaginable. Admirers noted, also fairly, that most people in his position would have quietly settled and said nothing. Both things could be true simultaneously, which is how most moments of public courage actually work. The woman he had been messaging, Lauren Sanchez, was herself navigating a newly scrutinized existence. A former television host and the founder of an aerial film company, she was smart, accomplished, and entirely prepared to be reduced by tabloids to a simpler story than the one she actually represented. She and Bezos became a visible couple, attending galas and charity events in a public way that felt like a deliberate statement after years of studied privacy. He changed, or at least the version of himself he presented to the world changed. A leaner physique, a wardrobe with a little more intention behind it, a persona that seemed looser and more willing to inhabit the spectacle of his own extraordinary life. Whether these changes reflected something genuine or were simply the natural self-revision that follows any seismic personal rupture, only he could say for certain. What was visible from the outside was a man reintroducing himself, performing a kind of controlled relaunch at an age when most people are finished becoming who they're going to be. Mackenzie, for her part, needed no relaunch. She had already become someone entirely new, and she had done it with a quietness that made the transformation more striking for its lack of announcement. The woman who had once been described primarily in relation to her famous husband was now being described in relation to her own choices, her own money, her own moral commitments. Whatever the divorce cost each of them privately, and the private cost of ending a 25-year partnership, regardless of the wealth involved, is something no amount of careful public statements can fully conceal. It produced two distinct figures where there had been one shared story, and history would have ample room to assess both of them on their own terms. Chapter 9. Eyes on the Stars. He wore a cowboy hat. That is, perhaps, the detail history will choose to argue about most. Not the rocket, not the billions, not the audacity of the whole enterprise, but the cream-colored 10-gallon hat that Jeff Bezos planted on his head on the morning of July 20, 2021, before climbing into a spacecraft. It was either the most self-aware fashion choice in the history of aerospace or the least. Either way, it was very Jeff. But strip away the hat, and what you were actually watching was a 57-year-old man fulfilling a promise he had made to himself as a small boy lying on a living room floor, eyes locked on a television screen, watching astronauts do something that seemed reserved only for gods. He had grown up on Star Trek and Apollo, on the crackling voices of mission control and the impossible geometry of rockets punching through atmosphere. The cosmos hadn't been an escape for young Jeff. It had been a destination. And on that Tuesday morning in the West Texas desert, with his brother Mark beside him, he finally showed up. The rocket was called New Shepard, named after Alan Shepard, the first American to reach space. Blue Origin, the aerospace company Bezos had been quietly bankrolling since the year 2000, had developed it over 2 decades with the dogged patience of a man who understood that the most important things are built slowly. Then suddenly, he had funded the venture out of his own pocket, roughly $1 billion a year at its peak, without the fanfare he could have summoned at any moment. While Amazon burned bright in every headline, Blue Origin grew in near silence, testing and failing and testing again in the same obscurity that most ambitious things require before they're ready to be seen. Stepping down as Amazon's CEO earlier that year had been framed publicly as a pivot, a deliberate leaning in toward Blue Origin and his other ventures, and maybe it was. But there's also something worth sitting with in that moment. The man who had built one of the most powerful companies in human history, who had effectively reshaped the way civilization shopped and stored data and consumed information, choosing to walk away from that throne to go chase rockets. You can read it as megalomaniacal. Not content with dominating Earth, he wanted space too. You can also read it as something quieter and stranger, as a person finally giving himself permission to go back for the thing he actually wanted all along. The flight lasted approximately 11 minutes. New Shepard crossed the Kármán line, the internationally recognized boundary between Earth's atmosphere and outer space, at roughly 351,000 feet. For a few weightless minutes, Bezos and his 3 crewmates, his brother, an 82-year-old aviation pioneer named Wally Funk, and a Dutch teenager named Oliver Damon, floated inside the capsule, looking out of the largest windows ever flown in space. Below them, the curvature of the Earth. Above them, nothing at all. He cried when he landed. He said it was more profound than he had expected. He threw his arms wide and laughed, and then his voice broke, and he stood in the desert with tears cutting through the dust on his face while his team roared around him. Say what you want about the billionaire optics, about the extravagance of spending incalculable personal wealth on an 11-minute joyride, and critics said plenty, but the emotion in that moment was not performed. You can sometimes tell when a person is crying because the cameras are there, and this wasn't that. This was someone who had carried something for 50 years and had just been allowed finally to put it down in the right place. The backlash was loud and immediate, of course, because the backlash is always loud and immediate. Late-night hosts eviscerated the rocket's, shall we say, anatomically suggestive shape. Activists pointed out that the same week Bezos went to space, Amazon warehouse workers in multiple states were fighting for basic protections. A petition to prevent him from returning to Earth briefly accumulated hundreds of thousands of signatures, which is either a biting commentary on inequality or the funniest thing the internet produced that year, depending on your disposition. Senator Bernie Sanders posted that we didn't need billionaires in space. Astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson posted the opposite. Twitter, true to form, held both views simultaneously and with equal ferocity. Bezos, for his part, seemed genuinely unbothered, not in the defensive, pre-coached way, but in the way of someone who had decided long ago that the criticism was the price of the vision and had already agreed to pay it. At a press conference after the flight, he thanked Amazon workers and Amazon customers, acknowledging that they had, in a very direct sense, paid for the rocket. It was either an admirably honest thing to say or a spectacularly tin-eared one, and the internet's verdict was swift and largely unprintable. The vision itself, stripped of all the theater, is genuinely enormous. Bezos believes, and has said so repeatedly in speeches and interviews, with the calm certainty of someone who has thought about little else for decades, that the long-term survival of human civilization requires moving heavy industry off Earth, not as science fiction, as logistics. Earth in his framing is a residential zone, a garden to be preserved, while the energy-intensive, resource-hungry machinery of industry migrates into orbit, eventually into the solar system, eventually beyond. He imagines 1 trillion humans spread across the cosmos, living in O'Neill cylinders, enormous rotating habitats dreamed up by physicist Gerard O'Neill in the 1970s, each one a world unto itself. Critics call this the ultimate act of deflection, a man whose company has contributed meaningfully to the ecological and economic pressures of our time, now proposing that the solution is to simply expand the frontier rather than reckon with what was done to this one. Believers call it the only idea with a long enough horizon to actually matter. Both things can, in the maddening way of complex truths, be partially right. What's harder to dismiss is the sincerity. Bezos has spoken about this vision in the same voice for 20 years. Before the wealth was incomprehensible, before the fame was inescapable, before the rocket was built. The dream preceded the empire. The cowboy hat and the tears in the desert were, in their own strange way, the most honest thing he had ever shown the public. He looked up at the sky for most of his life before he got to see what was on the other side of it, and when he finally did, he wept like anyone would. Chapter 10. The Unfinished Blueprint. Somewhere in the Library of Congress, historians are probably already arguing about him. That is not a metaphor or a projection. It is simply what happens when a person rewires enough of the world during his own lifetime. The argument starts before the story ends, before the last chapter can even announce itself. Jeff Bezos has not yet left the stage, and the critics are already sharpening their final judgments. The admirers are already polishing their eulogies, and somewhere in all that noise is the complicated truth of a man who built things that will outlast almost everything else built in his era. History tends to simplify. It takes sprawling, self-contradicting human beings and sands them down into monuments or cautionary tales, heroes or villains, visionaries or robber barons. Bezos may be the rare figure who genuinely resists that flattening, not because he is mysterious or unknowable, but because the ledger of his life is so staggeringly full on both sides. The assets and the liabilities are both enormous, and they are not easy to net out. On the asset side, a man who sat in a garage in the mid-90s with a ridiculous idea, who saw something in the internet that most executives were still waving away as a fad, and who refused to stop building even when Wall Street told him he was bleeding money recklessly, even when the dot-com crash turned his paper wealth to confetti, even when reasonable voices suggested maybe it was time to slow down. He did not slow down. He never once seemed to understand the concept of slowing down. Amazon became not merely a company but a kind of permanent infrastructure, as embedded in modern life as electricity or the postal service, and, depending on whom you ask, considerably more reliable than either. AWS alone changed the architecture of the global economy in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. The modern internet, the streaming services people watch at midnight, the apps people order dinner from, the government systems that process millions of transactions invisibly every hour, enormous portions of all of it run on servers that Bezos and his team had the foresight to build and lease before most of the world understood why anyone would need them. That is not a minor footnote. That is a civilizational contribution, regardless of one's feelings about the man who made it. And yet, on the other side of that ledger sit all the things that a stock price cannot redeem. The workers who described warehouse floors like something out of a dystopian thought experiment. The policy debates about market concentration and monopoly power that Amazon's dominance helped reignite. The sober recognition that when one person accumulates more wealth than entire nations produce in a year, something structural in the economy is either broken or bending in a direction most democracies never intended. Bezos did not invent inequality, but he became its most legible symbol, the face that appeared in every op-ed and protest sign when people searched for a way to make the abstract feel concrete. He is aware of this, or at least he performs awareness of it in ways that are sometimes compelling and sometimes transparently insufficient. The philanthropic pledges, the climate commitments, they are real money, real gestures, and they also cannot fully answer the charge that the system he built was engineered from the beginning to extract maximum value from minimum labor cost. Both things can be true. That is what makes him interesting rather than simply guilty or simply innocent. What is perhaps most remarkable and most underexamined is the question of what it costs to be Jeff Bezos. Not in dollars, but in the private accounting that money cannot settle, the divorce, the phone hacking, the years of public caricature, alternating between Bond villain and tech prophet depending on the week's headlines, the very qualities that made him extraordinary, the long-term thinking, the almost maniacal focus, the willingness to sacrifice short-term comfort for distant goals, are not qualities that make for an easy or uncomplicated inner life. Intensity at that level does not switch off at 6 o'clock. It does not take holidays. The person who built Amazon did not build it by being restful or yielding or satisfied, and restlessness, even productive restlessness, carries a cost that the earnings reports never itemize. He turned 60 in 2024, which is a strange milestone for someone who still carries the energy of a man chasing something just over the horizon. Blue Origin continues its grinding, incremental march toward a future Bezos has described in terms that would sound grandiose from anyone else. A civilization spread across the solar system, heavy industry relocated off the planet, Earth restored to something like a garden. The timelines have slipped as space timelines always do. The skeptics are loud, but so were the skeptics in 1994 when a man quit a perfectly good hedge fund job to sell books out of a garage and told his bemused parents he thought it might work. He has been underestimated before. He finds it useful. The question that hangs over everything now is the question that always attaches itself to people who remake the world. What is the remake for? Power is the obvious answer, and it is probably partly true because power is always partly true. Ego is another answer, and it is probably partly true as well. But there is also something else in Bezos that does not reduce cleanly to either, something that looks, at its best moments, like genuine awe at what's possible, at what hasn't been tried yet, at how much of the future remains unbuilt and waiting. He looked up at the stars as a child and never fully stopped. That is either beautiful or terrifying, and most likely it is some inseparable combination of the two. The story, as of this writing, is unfinished. The blueprint has been drawn and redrawn, scaled and expanded, fought over by regulators and celebrated by investors and cursed by competitors and relied upon by billions of ordinary people who have never once thought about Jeff Bezos while clicking the button that delivers something to their door in 2 days. That is its own kind of legacy. A presence so woven into daily life that it becomes invisible, which is perhaps the most durable thing any builder can achieve. History will argue. History will simplify where it should not. It will probably deliver a verdict that is too clean, too certain, stripping away the contradictions that make the man real. But the fingerprints will remain, on the box at your door, on the server humming in a data center you'll never see, on the idea that someone ordinary in a garage with an outrageous belief in what was possible could reach out and rearrange the world, and that the rest of us would spend decades trying to decide how we felt about it. Some stories end on screen but stay with you long after. If this one did, subscribe, and the next one might hit even deeper.